start the video.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CLERB special meeting in Town Hall. And our first agenda item is roll call. And Pastor Spriggs, I see you're on. Could you take roll call, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Right. Susan Youngflesh. Eileen Delaney.
Here.
Pastor Robert Spriggs Jr. I am present. Buki Domingos.
Here.
Nadia Keen Ayub. Bonnie Kink.
Here.
Marianne Pintar.
Here.
Tim Ware.
Here.
And G.I. Wilson.
Here.
Okay.
I believe we have a quorum. Thank you very much. First agenda item is, oh, you know what I have? I'm sorry, my agenda says, but it's to continue teleconferencing. Ms. Hoffman, could you read us? Where are you? There you are.
So the finding that CLERB would have to make to continue teleconferencing would be a motion that CLERB has reconsidered the circumstances of the state of emergency and that state and local officials continue to recommend measures to promote social distancing.
Okay. Do we have a motion to continue virtual meetings? We have a motion by GI. Do we have a second? Second by Tim Ware. Any discussion? Any discussion from the public? If not, Pastor Spriggs, could you do the roll, please?
It looks like you might have a member of the public wishing to comment.
Oh.
Okay.
I don't see.
I apologize if I'm incorrect. I just want to make sure that we aren't disregarding anyone from the public.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't.
You
Paul,
are, yes, Ms. Pintar is correct, and
Okay.
this will be Miss Francine Maxwell.
Ms. Maxwell?
Good evening, Francine Maxwell. Sorry that I was slow trying to push my button. I just wanted to support that you do the teleconferencing. If we could just be more conscious and intentional, CLERB meetings are just so important to the county and the community, but it's also the same night. This special meeting is for the CPP. And I know that a lot of commissioners and a lot of residents, they want to make sure that they keep abreast of everything. So if we can just be conscious of how we schedule, because this is like the third meeting in a row of the CLERB that also was the open session for the public for the CPP of the city of San Diego. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you very much. All right. Any other comments?
Vice
Mr.
Chair
Parker?
Delaney, no, ma'am.
Okay, great. Thank you. In that case, Pastor Spriggs, if you could take the roll.
Okay. Susan Youngflesh. Eileen Delaney.
Yes.
Pastor Robert Spriggs Jr. Yes. Buki Domingos.
Yes.
Nadia Keen Ayub. Bonnie Kink.
No.
Marianne Pintar.
Yes.
Tim Ware.
Yes.
And G.I. Wilson.
Yes.
I believe the motion carries. So we will continue. Our next meeting will be virtual. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to new business, which is our CLERB Town Hall pertaining to the California State Audit Report. And I will turn it over to Ms. Domingos and Mr. Ware.
If I may, Mr. Ware.
Yes, please.
Hi, everyone, and welcome this evening to this special CLERB meeting. And I hear you, Ms. Maxwell. This has been the third meeting in a row. But as a board, we see it very important to address issues and concerns that come up as they come up. And at this point, I will pass this on to Mr. Paul Parker, who will be the co-facilitator for this special meeting this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Domingos. Thank you all the members of the public, members of the board for appearing at this very critical topic, this town hall. What I'd like to do is introduce the acting California State Auditor, Michael Tilden, and Michelle Sanders. Ms. Sanders did a lot of the work on the audit, and obviously Mr. Tilden is the acting state auditor. We are fortunate enough to have Mr. Tilden until 6 o'clock this evening. So I'd like to turn it over to him. I do acknowledge that we do have some members of the public who have lost loved ones, and they're here with us tonight, and they'll have an opportunity to speak after Mr. Tilden's presentation, and he answers any questions that the board or the public may have. So I acknowledge that first and foremost, and my condolences to those folks that have experienced such a loss. In the meantime, we'll go to Mr. Tilden and Ms. Sanders. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. For the record, I'm Mike Tilden, the acting state auditor, and as you said, joining me is Michelle Sanders. She was the team leader on the audit. So as you know, we released this audit report on February 3rd of this year. And just to clarify, Mr. Parker, would you like me to walk through the findings and the recommendations, or did you want to start out with some questions? I can go either way.
You know, I think what you did for the Board of Supervisors last week was very beneficial, at least for me sitting in the audience, having read your report numerous times. So I think if you could start with that,
Sure.
and then open it up to questions afterwards,
Okay.
if that will work for you.
Okay, will do. Okay, so just to set the stage, the Joint Legislative Audit Committee really, they approved an audit request of the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, and the focus was really on the number of in-custody deaths. And there were really two key questions that they were asking. And one was, why have so many individuals been dying in the custody of the San Diego Sheriff's Department over a number of years? And secondly, what corrective actions has the San Diego Sheriff taken in response to those deaths? Those were the two key questions that we were asked. So to set the stage, one of the first things we did is we got some data from the Department of Justice on the number of deaths in San Diego, their detention facilities over the last 15 years, basically from 2006 all the way through 2021. And what we found is more than 200 individuals have died in San Diego County detention facilities over that 16-year period, including 18 deaths just in 2021. And I want to point out that that is really the second highest number of deaths in a county jail, other than Los Angeles County's jail system, which obviously has a much larger average daily jail population. But what the team also did, beyond just looking at the total numbers of in-custody deaths, they also looked at the in-custody death rate. And so basically that was a comparison of the death rates based on the average daily jail population. And we actually have a graphic in our report that shows that analysis. And unfortunately, when you look at the rate of deaths, the deaths in San Diego County's jails were the highest in the state. And so given the high number of deaths, the next thing the team did is try to figure out what's causing these deaths, where are the breakdowns occurring? And in order to do that, they reviewed the results or the case files for 30 in-custody deaths that occurred over the last 15 years. And the sample was a little more focused on the more recent time period. In addition to reviewing case files, the team also reviewed video surveillance to the extent that it was available. And in doing that, really identified a number of key breakdowns that were occurring in San Diego's jails. Number one, there was insufficient health evaluations at intake. In other words, when the Sheriff's Department was booking individuals into its detention facilities, they weren't doing a good job of identifying individuals with medical or mental health needs. In San Diego, they don't require that a mental health professional be involved in the intake and be a part of assessing individuals' potential mental health needs. And because of that, we found in our sample of 30 that 8 individuals that had serious mental health or medical issues, those issues weren't identified at intake. And unfortunately, we found that 5 of those 8 individuals died within 4 days of their arrest. Related to that, we also found that individuals that had medical needs, mental health issues, they also weren't getting proper follow-up care. And again, in our sample of 30, we noted individuals that complained to San Diego's sworn staff of various mental health or medical symptoms, but they weren't really given access to a doctor to discuss their concerns promptly. And in fact, they ended up dying in some cases before they were able to see a medical professional. The other really important breakdown that the team identified is that one of the key controls in San Diego's detention facilities is that the officers are required to do safety checks every hour, where they literally have to walk by every cell, and they're supposed to ensure that the incarcerated individuals are alive, well, they're breathing, that they're okay. But in looking at the video surveillance, the team noticed in a number of times that the sworn officers in San Diego were walking by these cells every hour on the hour, and sometimes without breaking stride, they'd make a quick glance into the cell and keep moving forward. And we identified situations where 4 or 5 hours later, a sworn officer would walk by and would finally realize that an incarcerated individual was non-responsive and in fact had actually died several hours earlier, but nobody noticed it. So this is a real key control for monitoring the health and safety of individuals in San Diego's custody. And there were just breakdowns that were occurring in the cases that we looked at. We also noted situations where sworn staff and sometimes medical staff were a little slow to respond to medical emergencies. And because of that, in certain cases, I believe that life-saving measures were unnecessarily delayed. So that was, again, it was another breakdown where the San Diego County Sheriff's staff were just slow to respond to these emergencies. And just in terms of a couple other things I wanted to say, one is that there is a state agency, it's the Board of State and Community Corrections, that is responsible for setting minimum standards for all detention facilities in the entire state. And these standards are supposed to ensure the health and safety of individuals in custody in county jails, but this state entity really sees those standards as minimum standards. In other words, standards that different detention facilities in the state with different levels of resources can really adhere to. But their expectation is at the individual county jail level that they develop more robust policies and procedures that are responsive to the risks in that particular jail. But what we found, and we looked at not only San Diego, but 3 other counties, that by and large, the county jail systems aren't doing a good job of developing more robust policies and procedures to protect the individuals in their custody. We did notice some best practices in Riverside County. They do require a mental health professional to be involved in intake and to see every individual that's booked to identify any mental health issues, which we think is a best practice that San Diego and other counties, frankly, should employ. We also found that at the state level, the Department of Corrections, they have more robust policies that require their correctional officers, when they're making those hourly rounds, to make a more robust check, to really check to ensure that each individual is really alive, well, safe, and is actually breathing. And again, we feel that San Diego needs to strengthen their policies and procedures so that those critical safety checks are more robust. The other key thing that we found is that in light of this high number of deaths that are happening down in the San Diego County detention facilities, we expected that the Sheriff's Department would have a very robust process for investigating these deaths and looking at policies and procedures to figure out where did the breakdowns occur and what lessons could be learned to tighten up policies and procedures to prevent similar deaths in the future. But by and large, even though the San Diego County Sheriff's Department conducts different reviews, they're generally not very well documented. They're generally not made available to the public. So there's a lack of transparency. And most importantly, they don't seem to be focused on identifying corrective actions to minimize and prevent similar deaths in the future. We also found that San Diego hasn't necessarily done a great job of implementing recommendations from other external parties that have identified some of the same deficiencies that we did. For example, the county grand jury, San Diego County grand jury, a suicide prevention specialist, and CLERB itself have come forward with different recommendations over the years that the San Diego County Sheriff didn't always do a good job of implementing. In terms of CLERB, which I think is probably most pertinent to everyone in this meeting, we took a look at CLERB's oversight of deaths in the San Diego County detention facilities. And I know, as you all know, the voters in San Diego County basically approved the Citizens Law Enforcement Review Board, or CLERB, back in 1990. And one of the key responsibilities is really to investigate in custody deaths. But in looking at our sample of deaths, we found a number of shortcomings. One, we found that CLERB's investigations are not as independent as they really should be. We found that CLERB is oftentimes having to rely on evidence that the sheriff's office is providing from its own investigations. And we found that oftentimes CLERB doesn't have an opportunity to basically interview witnesses, specifically sworn officers. And they aren't always getting an opportunity to visit the initial scene of the death. And it's our understanding that oftentimes CLERB investigators don't get the results of the sheriff's department's reviews until several months later. We also found that over the years, there was a time period when CLERB wasn't prioritizing in custody deaths over some of the other complaints that they investigate. And partly because of that, didn't investigate roughly 57 in custody deaths over the time period of 2006 to 2017. And finally, we found in certain cases, we thought that there were discrepancies in some of the investigations and some of the case files that we looked at that really weren't adequately followed up on. So we think that there's some room for improvement there. In terms of CLERB, in terms of our recommendations, we had a recommendation that CLERB be able to conduct independent interviews of sheriff's department sworn staff. And we understand that there are some complications in doing that. We understand that there have been some agreements over the years with the sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department's the sworn officers, basically their union. And so where we're coming from there is we have a recommendation to the sheriff's department that it try to facilitate the ability of CLERB's investigators to actually interview sworn officers. The other recommendation we have is that CLERB needs to revise its rules and recommendations to prioritize in custody deaths, and also to specify that it's going to review in custody deaths that are classified as natural. It's my understanding that there was a period of time when CLERB was not investigating natural deaths. And as I said before, I think it's important that CLERB do that, because in some cases, even though some of these individuals are dying in custody because of natural causes, it may be related to a mental health or a medical issue that was not properly attended to. And finally, we have a recommendation that CLERB modify its comprehensive training manual to ensure that its investigations are really thorough and that any discrepancies are reconciled. In terms of the sheriff's department, we spent a lot of time thinking about the recommendations for the sheriff, and because the sheriff is elected by the voters in San Diego County, and because the County Board of Supervisors only has a certain amount of authority over a separately elected sheriff, and there really isn't a state department, not even the Attorney General, that really has is really very well positioned to push the sheriff's department to make important changes. All of our recommendations related to the sheriff's department were recommendations to the California state legislature. And so we recommended that the legislature require the San Diego sheriff to make improvements to shore up all the deficiencies that I talked about. For example, to require the San Diego sheriff to improve its intake procedures, to have a mental health professional that's there and as part of the booking process, to properly identify individuals with mental health or medical issues. We recommend the legislature require the San Diego County Sheriff to ensure that incarcerated individuals are getting timely access to follow-up care for medical and mental health issues. And also that it clarify its policy that these hourly safety checks that I talk about need to include ensuring that individuals in their cells are still alive and are breathing. Finally, for the sheriff, we recommended that the legislature require them to improve the robustness of their reviews of any future in custody deaths, to require, for example, that the reviews be documented, that they be transparent, and that most importantly, that they be focused on any needed improvements to policies and procedures to prohibit or to limit deaths in the future. Finally, we had recommendations at the state level to this Board of State and Community Corrections, where we're recommending that they change their regulations to really raise the bar and in all these areas to clarify what a safety check should entail, to clarify that for larger jails, they really should have a mental health professional that's there and as a part of the intake process, and that they also increase the training requirements for correctional officers and for sworn staff in detention facilities. So that's really an overview of the key findings, the key recommendations. At this point, Michelle and I can answer any questions that you may have, or if you want to drill down in any more detail into any of these other areas, we can do that too.
Thank you so much to the acting state auditor for that report. Before we take questions, I would like to quickly acknowledge the office of Assembly Member of the 79th District, Dr. Akila Weber. Her staff, her director, her district director is here today, Chevelle Tate. And on behalf of the office of Dr. Akila Weber, I would like to thank the state auditor again for the audit. And so I'll pass it on now to Mr. Paul Parker, and I'd also like to acknowledge the family of Saxon Rodriguez as well.
Thank you, Ms. Domingos. I also wanted to acknowledge, first off, thank you, Mr. Tilden, and thank you, Ms. Sanders. I'm sure we're going to have some questions for you from board members, but we also do want to acknowledge Dr. Akila Weber's office is present. Chevelle Tate is here. That's important because Dr. Weber just put forward, along with some other Assembly folks, Assembly Bill 2343 that's going to address, it's an attempt to address just about all of the recommendations that the California State Auditor has just discussed. So I think that's an important thing to note. And I also think it's important to note that there are community members in this audience right now, specifically Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego, Stand Up for Racial Justice North County, who pushed this issue as well prior to the audit being conducted and prior to CLERB conducting its own independent death data analysis that'll be released next month. So I think that needs to be addressed. I also think it does need to be addressed, and I wanted to move forward after the state auditor takes the questions to acknowledge the Sheriff's Department is not here tonight. They did respond saying that they would not be able to make it tonight. However, they are supportive of the recommendations, of course, that the auditor has made, and they've already instituted many of them, as has CLERB, and I can talk about that at a later time. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn this back over to Mr. Domingos. Any board members, I see that Pastor Spriggs has a question. Before I turn it back over, how about we just go to Pastor Spriggs because we're short on time for Mr. Tilden. Pastor Spriggs, your question for Acting State Auditor
Yes.
Mike Tilden.
Yes, thank you for your service, Mr. Tilden. So I just want to make sure that I heard this correctly. So you said between the year 2006 to 2017, there were 57 deaths that were not investigated?
Yes, that's my understanding, that from 2006 to 2017, there were 185 deaths that occurred during that time period.
How
And
many you said? 100 and what?
there were 185.
Okay, thank you.
And there were another, I want to say, there were another 18 in 2021.
Okay.
But in terms of that 2006 to 2017, there were 185, and 57 of those were not reviewed by CLERB. And my understanding is there are different reasons for that. I believe there were 13 deaths that were not investigated because this 1 year time limit for CLERB to complete its investigations had expired.
Okay.
And I believe that happened because there was a time when CLERB wasn't prioritizing investigating death cases. I believe there were another 40 cases or in custody deaths that CLERB didn't investigate because, again, there was a period of time when they didn't investigate deaths classified as natural deaths. So that was 40 of those deaths. And then finally, to round out the 57, there were another 4 deaths that CLERB didn't investigate because the Sheriff's Department failed to inform CLERB of their occurrence.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Mr. Ware, and before we go to Mr. Ware, Mr. Tilden is right on the money with his statistics. Exactly what he just said, that is the breakdown. Those 40, those happened before 2000, the 40 natural deaths, they happened before 2017. The 13 happened in 2017, and the other 4 happened around 2010, 2011. So yes, he's right on the money. Mr. Ware.
Yes, Mr. Tilden, and also Ms. Sanders. Ms. Sanders, thank you very much. I know you did a lot of work in leading that team over there. Thank you for the effort and providing this information to us. It's very important to us. Question I have for you is, you mentioned the in-custody death rate. Is that for the whole jail system of California? And if so, does that include like jail size or every jail system in the state? And then the follow-up question is, I believe you mentioned there are 3 other counties that you evaluated for another area, and I think I missed that part. If you can follow up for that for me, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, good question. So we did look at 3 other counties: Alameda County Sheriff's Office, Orange County Sheriff's Department, and Riverside County Sheriff's Department. But I would also point out, not sure if everyone has copies of our report, but we do have an appendix. Maybe Michelle can help me out. Page?
Yeah, on page 59.
On 59, we have, bear with me here a second. We have an appendix on page 59 that discloses the in-custody deaths in California's 15 largest counties. And so it basically gives you the total number of deaths. You can see, if you have a copy of that, basically what it shows is that the county sheriff's department with the most deaths over that 15-year period was Los Angeles, with 421 deaths, and followed by San Diego with 185 deaths. But what's different there is that the average daily jail population in Los Angeles is 17,000 incarcerated individuals versus only about 5,200 for San Diego. So when you look at the average death based on that average daily population of the 15 largest counties that we looked at in the state of California, unfortunately, the death rate in San Diego is the highest.
Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Miss Pintar.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your work and for being here tonight. I noted that in the report you mentioned Riverside as a sheriff's department that had an example of best practice of having a mental health professional at every intake. Is that correct? At every intake?
That's correct. That's my understanding, is that in Riverside County, they actually have a dedicated mental health practitioner that's part of that intake team. Mm-hmm. And is there when individuals are booked into the Riverside County jail system, and their role is specifically to evaluate the mental health of all the individuals coming into their jail system.
And at that evaluation, are they sometimes referred to something other than a detention facility?
It's my understanding that the key to having the mental health professional there at the intake is that they're able to identify individuals with mental health needs, and that you can use that information when you're making housing assignments and when you're making referrals for mental health care. Do you have anything you'd want to add to that, Michelle, potentially? Okay.
And sorry, just the last follow-up question to that. Are there other, I mean, is this unusual? Is Riverside unusual in counties that are similar size to ours and with a similar population, detained population? And are they sworn staff or not?
So first of all, at least in terms of the 4 counties that we specifically looked at, including San Diego, I believe Riverside County was the only one of those 4 that had this requirement that a mental health professional be involved at intake. And I think part of the problem, again, is that, and I think Dr. Weber's pending bill would address this, is again, this state entity, this Board of State and Community Corrections, they don't require that these county jails have a mental health professional involved at intake. And we just think that's really important, because without identifying the mental health needs of these individuals, you're really not in a good position to make proper housing assignments. And obviously you're not going to be connecting individuals to the critical follow-up care that they need.
I agree with you. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson.
Yes, sir. You mentioned the deputy's responsibility to make sure an inmate is alive and breathing. Do you have any recommendations other than waking the inmate up when he's asleep at night to do that? Is there a way to manage that without having to wake somebody up to make sure they're alive and breathing every hour?
Yeah, we discussed that concern, I think, with staff from Board of State and Community Corrections, as well as San Diego. And we understand that it wouldn't be healthy for incarcerated individuals if you had sworn staff waking them up every hour in the middle of the night. But we think, based on the video surveillance that we looked at, there's something between just walking by and just glancing into a cell and maybe spending a little more time to just take a harder look, make sure that you can see that somebody's breathing and their chest is going up and down. So we think there's a sweet spot in there that's more than just a cursory glance, but at the same time, it's not so invasive that you're waking people up in the middle of the night.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ware.
Thank you. I apologize for taking too much time, but we hear the term best practice. We hear it a lot. And in this case, we have Riverside County as best practice, and it's coming from a professional and his team who conducted an audit on this. So what's stopping the other agencies, the other counties from applying this best practice and making it a mandate?
And I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe that the bill that Dr. Weber and other members are working on would require the Board of State and Community Corrections to elevate their standards. And I think one of the things that it may be doing is requiring the Board of State and Community Corrections to provide more specificity of how these safety checks should be conducted so that they're more robust. And also, I believe, requiring that a mental health professional be involved in evaluating individuals at intake. So the beauty of having the Board of State and Community Corrections elevate their standards is that they would apply to all jail systems in the state, not just San Diego.
Right, thank you.
Ms. Dominguez, I do not see any other questions from board staff, or I'm sorry, board members, I apologize. there are at least two speakers, actually three speakers from the public.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Parker. I would like to say a few words, just to thank again the state auditor for being here today to address, especially we have at least one family member and a few that are going to be watching this recording. One of them couldn't be here today, the wife of Omar Moreno Arroyo. She was on her way to a press conference today and she got involved in a car accident. So please keep her in your prayers. But I would also like to provide a little bit of background before we let you go, Mr. Acting State Auditor. It's important in this work to also acknowledge grassroots organizations. And the two this evening that actually were the driving force behind the Saving Life in Custody Act are the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego and the North County Equity Justice Coalition, whom the co-founders are Brother Yusef Miller and Dr. Darwin Fishman. That being said, the Saving Life in Custody campaign was started in 2020 after the tragic passing of Elisa Serna, the pregnant woman who was found unresponsive in her jail cell. And I also wanted to applaud the office of Dr. Kila Weber again for her courage when the families cried out to her office for assistance to be able to push for a statewide audit, because we families and community members knew that there was something wrong, but we needed substantial information to be able to beg our arguments. So we thank you so much for stepping in and doing this audit. And I also wanted to say that the Saving Life in Custody campaign was started in 2020. And we thank also Assembly Member Dr. Kila Weber for the bill, the Assembly Bill 2343, which is also named the Saving Lives in Custody Act. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Paul Parker, and we will hear from the public. And again, we apologize to the public for having you wait to speak, but we also know that the acting state auditor just had 30 minutes to be with us tonight, and we wanted to take advantage of that. So thank you very much.
Mr. Tilden, are you still good on time? It looks like we have a couple of speakers that may have questions or comments directly to you.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem. I can wait.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tilden and Ms. Sanders. At this point, Tasha Williamson.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yes. I'm thankful to everyone who put this audit together and made this audit happen. Now that the audit has been done and the Sheriff's Department has shown absolutely no fear of consequences, 57 deaths, I heard Mike Tilden say. We only knew about 22 as a community. I heard Mike Tilden say that in the audit, they were giving recommendations because they knew more deaths would occur. Well, they have. We have 2 men who have died last week and 1 man who is in the hospital intubated for life-saving measures due to a brain trauma. 1 man found in a room dead filled with feces. Who will stand with the community to ask for the AG to step in and take over the jails with the special master? I am infuriated, asking for oversight, asking for accountability of officers and staff at jails. Today, progressive board members who we hoped would not be infected by the corruption within the Sheriff's Department voted unanimously for Anthony Ray, who allegedly had control over eviction during moratoriums. Evictions that seemed to have priority that was likened to special treatment or favors. The Board of Supervisors was aware of this eviction scandal that happened with this interim sheriff. We continue to watch as people we trust continue to show us that they don't care about community. We are tired. I am grateful to know the information that we know, not only from this audit, but from CPE, but we are done. We are done. There is no real oversight. We heard that today from Mike Tilden. We continue to ask, and it seems as though no matter what we do, there is a bureaucracy that continues to hold oversight and accountability at bay. Eventually, we will get tired and we will rise up and we will make it very uncomfortable in this city and this county. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williamson. Next, we will go to Yusef Miller. Mr. Miller.
Good evening. My name is Yusef Miller. I'm with the North County Equity and Justice Coalition and the Racial Justice Coalition of San Diego and the Saving Lives in Custody campaign of 2020. I am so thankful for Dr. Akilah Weber and her colleagues for pulling together AB 2343 to address these issues that we see in the in custody jail rate in San Diego County. But also I want to bring our attention to the San Diegans for Justice report that came out from Chicago about improvements and reform in the CLERB. So Andrea St. Julian, she is one of the people who authored that. Well, not authored it, but commissioned it to come out. And we think that has great suggestions as well for the improvement of not only the Sheriff's Department, but we're looking at the improvement in the CLERB and the strengthening the CLERB to do their investigative job. We are asking we have a vote of non-confidence in the Sheriff's Department to police and reform themselves. So we're asking for the AG, through whatever process it is, for Rob Bonta to come into San Diego County and appoint an overseer for this process to put in place the reforms that are necessary before the next sheriff is elected. And therefore they can be on autopilot and work with these reforms to save lives. We're only interested in saving lives. We're only interested in improving the state of dignity and humanity in our jails. We have the family of Saxon Rodriguez, Elisa Serna, Kevin Mills, and so many others that are crying on our shoulders who are asking for justice, asking for clarity, asking for information for their lost loved ones. They are not people who died from liver cirrhosis or someone from a brain tumor. They died from neglect, bias, and injustice in our jails. We need to look at this clearly. We need to support the families and save these lives. We are so thankful to Paul Parker and the CLERB for being proactive and been working with us since 2020, but now it's time to kick it in high gear. I thank you, Dr. Akilah Weber's office for helping us kick it into high gear, and let's keep this train moving, but we have no time to lose. 2 people died last week. Every moment we waste, more people will die, and it'll be on our heads because we know better. We absolutely know better at this point. So thank you for your time. Please consider expediting these reforms and these changes and not tie it up in bureaucracy. Thank you so much.
Mr. Miller, thank you. And before we move on to our next speaker, I do want to point out, I want to reference something that Ms. Williamson said, that the public had only known of 22 deaths. And that is true. I will tell you that I want to break that down for her, but for others. The 40 that are mentioned, I learned about those during the audit. Those are all natural deaths that happened prior to my arrival here that previous administrative folks here decided not to investigate. 13 that Mr. Tilden mentioned were in fact part of the 22. So there were 22, 13 of those were actually in the custody of the Sheriff's Department detention facilities. One other was a probationer, and then the others were either deputy involved shootings or folks who had died outside of the jail. So those 13 are part of the 22. And then those other 4 that Mr. Tilden had mentioned, we were never notified. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. That is the breakdown. And thank you for bringing that forward, Ms. Williamson. With that, we will go to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown, are you there?
I'm sorry to interject and interrupt.
Oh, I apologize.
Yeah, I would, at this point, I would like to, if possible, hear from a family member. We have the sister of Saxon Rodriguez and the mother that are willing to speak, if possible and acceptable to the board and Dr. Brown. I would like to have them speak first.
It's fine with me. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor.
Okay, with that, let me try to raise them up here to speaking.
Thank you.
Ms. Weddle. First and foremost, my condolences, Ms. Weddle, about Saxon. Are you there?
Yes, hello.
You feel free to
Sorry.
address
Yes.
Mr. Tilden or the board at this time.
I just want to start by saying am the older sister of Saxon Rodriguez. Saxon Rodriguez passed away last year in July 20th, 2021. My brother was in San Diego Sheriff's custody for 4 days before he passed away. His court date was the following day. He was 22 years old. His death has been ruled a overdose. Due to this, we are not getting any assistance in regards to the answers when it comes to my brother. The drugs that he accessed while he was in jail weren't his, because Chula Vista PD sent those drugs home in his belongings. We just want some answers. You know, my brother's death was 100% preventable. I was told by the detectives he was last accounted for and alive at 7 a.m. and located at 10. That's a 3-hour gap. So I'm just kind of curious as to what the guards were doing and why we don't have access to see if they were doing their hourly checks. Again, because it's been ruled an overdose, it seems as though they kind of just want us to get over it and it's nobody's fault but my brother's, but that is not accurate. His death was 100% preventable. You know, all the articles state no foul play, but to me, it's pretty foul if these officers are in the jail and they're on a 1-to-1 ratio. How is it that my brother passed away, or the 2 other deaths that just happened a few days ago? I mean, this number is rising. I just, you know, we want some change, some answers, most definitely some transparency.
And if the lines of communication between the victims' families and the CLERB and the state auditors could be kept open so that we don't feel like we have slipped through the cracks and been forgotten when it comes to Saxon's investigation. I know there is an active investigation happening right now, as well as a completed investigation by the homicide detectives, the Eric Garcia. We would really like to gain access to that information so that we also feel that we're a part of this investigation, and just kind of feels like we're being left out of the loop. I don't know if that's the protocol, but if a change could be made so that we are more actively involved in the investigation, or just communicated with on a regular basis. The 20th of this month was Saxon's 8-month anniversary, and we still feel really left in the dark. Thank you.
Thank you both.
That we have
Thank you both very much. What I would like to say, this is Paul Parker to Saxon's mom and sister. Ms. Weddle, I know that you and I had communicated via email, and just so you know, Lenore Aldridge is the investigator for us, and she will be getting in touch with you to ensure that you are kept in the loop about the status of our investigation. We've received the materials from the Sheriff's Department. I think when you and I maybe emailed in reference to the ME report a little while ago, we have 3 months from that time that I've implemented here internally to get the investigation completed from the time we get those materials on those deaths that have happened without us going out to the scene. And so Lenore will make sure that she gives you an update, but it is obviously a priority for us, and we hope to be able to move forward with that investigation and have it on our next, not on the April agenda, but hopefully as far as May, if that is some kind of, at least some kind of update for you, okay?
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. Ms. Domingos, and again, my condolences to both of you. Ms. Domingos, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. So at this point, and my condolences to the Rodriguez's family. I'm so sorry for your loss. At this point, we'd like to turn it over to Dr. Arlie Brown, and we apologize again for not calling you when it was your turn to speak. Dr. Brown.
Ma'am, can you all hear me?
Yes.
That's perfectly okay, because I would have preferred to hear from the family before I speak, and my condolences to them as well. Life is very precious, and I don't know what it is that I can do as an individual, but I'm there if it's anything I could ever do to I don't know how to convey it in words. I just feel really bad for a loved one, losing a loved one in any circumstance. But that also remind me. Do we have this question is to the first of all, before I say anything, is she finished? Does she have any more questions? The previous speaker. Is she fit? Okay. Do we have how many? This is to the auditor. Do we have a lot of deaths in the hospital where people are away from? I didn't get the number on the number of people who die out of the custody, but in the custody, but in different locations. I didn't get that number because I'm reviewing the audit, and I want to make sure I get all the information correct. I'm reading every page of it. So do we have, how many people do you know of, sir, that were in another location, not in the jails? And I'm looking forward to really being part of implementing the corrections to avoid these deaths, if it at all possible, as a community member. So can you tell me how many people in sheriff custody but were in the hospital at the time and died?
So let me speak to that, and I may have to have Michelle back me up with a little more detail. But my understanding is the deaths that we've talked about in our report, which is more than 200 deaths over the last 16 years, those are deaths of individuals actually in the San Diego County detention facilities. Those do not include individuals, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, if you have an individual in custody in San Diego and they have some kind of a mental health issue or a medical issue, and they have to go to a hospital, or they're discharged because they're in failing health, if they actually die in a hospital, I don't believe they're included in our counts. And I believe we had a recommendation that the San Diego County Sheriff begin tracking the number of individuals that, while they didn't actually die in custody, they died as a result of being in custody. Maybe they died a day after being released to a hospital. Do you have anything to clarify on that point, Michelle?
So our number of deaths, the 185, do include individuals who are still in custody, but may have been transported and died on the way to the hospital or in the hospital. So we're trying to look it up right now to get you that number. But what Mr. Tilden is talking about is, in some situations, we found that individuals had died in a hospital but had been released, even though an event had happened in the jail, and that hadn't been, that wouldn't be included in the 185. So we're trying to look up right now to see how many of the individuals who are in custody, but maybe had been transported for a short period of time to the hospital, died in the hospital. So,
but aren't there a subset of individuals, Michelle, that they were in custody and they had some sort of a health issue, and they're in such failing health that they're deemed low risk and they're actually discharged, but later shortly thereafter they die?
correct.
And those individuals, even though you could argue that potentially their death is related to their incarceration, would not be picked up
Correct.
in our numbers.
Correct.
And that means they're not picked up in the Attorney General's numbers, right?
Correct. They're not included in that number.
And don't we have a rec to shore that up?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Tilden and Ms. Sanders, if I may, and Dr. Brown, I hope you'll allow me. It's Paul Parker. Those deaths that you're talking about, I believe you're talking about those folks who go to the hospital after having something occur or become unresponsive or ill in the jail, and then they're compassionately released from custody. That's the terminology. If they are compassionately released, they do not count as a, quote, in custody death. However, I want everybody on the call to know, to include our board members and the public, of course, they are picked up. If we're notified about it, we automatically get involved in investigating those deaths, because ours does not say in custody. Our jurisdiction says deaths arising out of the actions or connection with the actions of sworn members. And we can contend that we don't know if those deaths are related to the actions of sworn members, because we don't have jurisdiction over medical. We don't know if they're related to sworn members unless we investigate. So even though they're not in custody, by state reporting standards, they do fall under our jurisdiction, and we do pursue them when we're made aware of them.
Okay, now my next question to you is, if you don't mind, do you know if any other counties do the same thing? In other words, if LA County or one of them, do they include those in their deaths? If they've released one to a hospital, or for whatever reason they're not, they've been in custody, but they're at the hospital or on the way to the hospital, do you know if they count those among their deaths?
Do you know, Michelle?
So in the other counties that we looked at, we also found other situations where an individual had something happen to them in the jail. They were transported to the hospital and they were at some point released. Sometimes it's compassionate release. We saw other types of releases as well. And then they weren't counted. But if somebody is still in the custody of the sheriff, they do report that even if they die in the hospital. And I do have an update for you on that number. There were 70 deaths over the 15-year period of individuals that died in the hospital. That's out of the 185.
Okay, now I would like to do some more follow-up, because it is my understanding from my review, my peer reviews and investigations, that the other counties do not count them, and San Diego is the only county that account for those deaths, and other departments don't. But I could be wrong, and I want to make sure that I'm correct again. So I'm going to continue to review and investigate this to make sure that I provide you all with correct information. But thank you anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And before we move back to Ms. Domingos for a second, I do want to say that it should be noted that the Sheriff's Department recently, since I've been here, has been reporting when they're aware of a compassionate release who dies, somebody who's been compassionate released and they die, they have been reporting those to us. That I know for certain. I'm not certain about their reporting to the state because they don't meet the in-custody death standard at that point. However, Ms. Domingos, we have 2 additional requests to speak from the public, Mr. Miller and Ms. Williamson. I do not see any board members, and I do have 1 request to speak from Francine Maxwell that I received prior to the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. At this point, I'm not sure if AC Mills is with us. He might be logged on under a different name, but if you're with us, Mr. Mills, please feel free to raise your hand. We would love to hear from you if you would like to speak. Back to you, Mr. Parker.
Mr. Tilden, are you still good on time? You're muted, sir.
Yeah, I'm here. We can hang out. I want to make sure that if there are any questions that you'd like us to answer, we're available.
Mr. Tilden and Ms. Sanders, thank you so very much. Mr. Miller, Yusef Miller.
Yes, I already spoke, and that was everything that I had to say, outside of also announcing the loss of life of Omar Arroyo, who's also his wife is on our team and supporting us, of the names that we've been working with. I just wanted to honor his name and say his name, Omar Arroyo.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Of course, our condolences to Mr. Arroyo. Next, we'll go to Tasha Williamson. Ms. Williamson. I had you here as wanting to speak. Bear with me for just a second, man. I don't see Ms. Williamson. She was here a second ago. Oh, here she comes. Hold on 1 second. Ms. Williamson, are you there?
Yes. After hearing Dr. Brown speak, I was really concerned because I know that when Earl McNeil was murdered, he was released into the ICU as a John Doe. And so I'm concerned that there are likely a number of cases where this has occurred, and possibly your board and of course the state has not been aware of those cases. I do want to mention that just last week, a jury came to an $85 million settlement agreement for Mr. Lucky's family, someone who also died in custody in the back of an ambulance. And it is, I just want to know if that case was transferred over to the board, and also if he was part of the state's audit.
Miss Williamson, I can, we're talking about Lucky Fauci, yes?
Yes.
I can tell you that that CLERB investigated Mr. Fauci's death, I believe it was 2015, ma'am.
Correct.
CLERB at the time did investigate the death, and it's my understanding, I went back and researched this, it's my understanding that our board felt that there were no inappropriate actions on the part of sworn personnel. That was my understanding. I believe that our board recommended action justified, and the staff recommended that, as my understanding, and the board approved that.
And Mr. Tilden?
Yeah, so I think that unfortunately, that individual, I believe, would be included in our numbers because that death would have been reported to the Department of Justice.
Yeah. I really wish that we had known about this prior, because I believe that if this board had found that Mr. Richard Fisher was at fault, he may not have assaulted 16 women. And I find it very sad. So I hope that this board and the State Department really, begin to look at holding officers accountable. I think that it is time. So I don't know how they came to that conclusion back in 2015, but a jury found that there was excessive force, and that to the tune of $85 million. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williamson. Ms. Domingos, we have one additional public speaker outside of Ms. Maxwell, and that's Doris Batar.
Yes, let's please hear from Ms. Batar, and then we may hear from Ms. Maxwell, if that so pleases the board.
Ms. Batar, are you there?
Yes, I am. I've been in and out. I have to make dinner. I'm Doris Bitar. I'm from the California organizer for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and I'm part of the Racial Justice Coalition. You know, I've been in San Diego 36 years, and it was about 34 years ago that a phrase was used between the police of victims of crimes. There was a hierarchy, and it was based on income and race. And people who were just not up to par were called, they were called NHI cases, or no humans involved. This is an old story. And other police departments around the country did that. I think we can't go forward without addressing the racial people of color disproportionately who die in these situations and the recruiting of officers. And I heard recently some officers, recruits from the sheriff's department went to an anti-vaxxers rally to find police officer recruits. And I don't think it's a rumor. It came from a very reliable source. And I'm just like, there are tests to test people's racism. There are ways of recruiting police and enlisting mental health professionals. There's a balance here that the department has to not just go for, but I'm not cynical. I think there needs to be complete overhaul of the system because it's really corrupt to the core. And it's based on race. Recruits are not cleared for not being racists. And I just want to put that out there. I know it's been brought up at other meetings, but I want to just emphasize it today. Thank you for the other speakers. It's the big elephant in the room. You know, no matter what you say, race is usually a culprit. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bitar. Ms. Domingos, we have Ms. Maxwell ready to speak. Is that like a move
Yes,
forward? Ms. Maxwell?
please. Yes, please. Go ahead, Ms. Francine Maxwell. And thank you for joining us today.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Of course, my condolences to all the families who've ever lost over these years in the study. I wanted to ask the interim auditor, looking at all the cases that you saw, I really don't know if I can ask the auditor, if I can just ask CLERB to answer me later on, but I'm concerned when a human being goes in with a certain amount of drugs in their system, and then they're getting more drugs as they're being incarcerated. Did that factor into any type of audit? Because I know that if I did fentanyl, hypothetically, if I did something on the street, and then I come in the pre-assessment and initial lab work, something occurs and we may have a loss of life. But when the autopsy does get unsealed and gets shared, then that person had 3 times as much of an illegal substance in their system that had to come from the inside. And so I'm just trying to connect the dots on when are we going to have a deep dive conversation about who is bringing it inside, how is it being passed around, and things like that. Did that factor into any part of the audit?
So I'm sorry, I was just looking through our report really quick. We did not specifically look at that. But one of the things that we did look at, and I'm looking at page 17 of our report, we have a table where we did break down the 185 deaths that occurred over the 15-year period into certain categories of whether they were classified as accidental deaths or homicide by law enforcement officer or homicide by other inmate. We looked at suicide was another category, and 52 of those individuals that died in San Diego's custody actually died by suicide. And then natural causes. And I'd have to ask Michelle, but I believe that I'm not sure if somebody died of an overdose, it seems like that would be in the accidental death category. So that's where we would have picked up the number, but that's not something, we didn't specifically look into that.
Okay, and then one more question is, so a person got into an accident, and of course, there may have been excessive force coming in. They are taken to the hospital. And if the hospital's assessment isn't thorough and they release a human being into the jail system that should not have been released, isn't that medical malpractice, or is that counted as the in custody death?
That I'm not sure about that. I'm really not sure.
Okay, no worries. I think that I put that in there, Mr. Parker. I just wanted to get some clarity because I wanted to ask someone, how come I can't have drug sniffing dogs for all the sheriffs that are inside that may or may not be passing illegal substances? So I just had random questions, and so I can just wait and submit them to CLERB. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
So I could add one thing just to try to do a better job answering that last question, if that's okay. The categorization of the in custody deaths, whether it's accidental or by suicide or homicide, it's the medical examiner that makes those determinations. So maybe that's helpful.
And Ms. Maxwell and Mr. Tilden, if I may speak to that just for a second. Ms. Dominguez, I see your hands up, but please allow me to address this. Unfortunately, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Campman, could not be here tonight. He wanted to be here, but unfortunately, he could not be here tonight. I can tell you from my almost 25 years of experience dealing with medical legal death investigations here and most of the Southwestern US, that yes, the manner of death is determined by the medical examiner's office. In reference to Ms. Maxwell's questions about overdoses or whatnot, and the accidental component, that's determined by the medical examiner's office. Now, the medical examiner's office, I want to be very clear here, and I wish they were here to speak for themselves, but to be very clear, there are 58 counties in San Diego, 40 or in California, 49 of them are sheriff coroner offices. I think the public needs to be aware, San Diego is not one of them. San Diego has its own independent medical examiner's office that does independent investigations into the death. I know for a fact that there are community concerns about the medical examiner's office being in cahoots, for lack of a better term, with the sheriff's department and coming up with causes and manners of death and working together to do that. I, as the independent oversight executive officer who knows this chief medical examiner very well and who learned more about in-custody death investigations from him 20 years ago than any other person in my career, and I know the chief investigator at the medical examiner's office very well. I am certain, I would bet my paycheck that they are not in cahoots. They do independent investigations and they opine what they believe. Now, having said that, and as a matter of proof, Sheriff Gore, when he was here last year, it was a newspaper article where he said that the medical examiner's office was wrong about a manner of death because the medical examiner said what he believed. I can also tell you that Dr. Cameron has reopened a case about 6 months ago, a death case, and came up with a different cause and manner of death when he obtained different information, and that was an in custody. It's a death that we considered as an in custody death. So I will tell you that I think I just want the public to be aware of the medical examiner role. But I will say the medical examiner gets the information from the respective departments, correct? So that being said, I can understand how people would think that they're in cahoots, but in this county, I would venture that they are not. And I am going to ask Dr. Campman to come to a future CLERB meeting where he can talk about these very questions about manner of death and how people who are young sometimes do die naturally in custody and things along those lines. So hopefully, Ms. Maxwell, that would answer your question. If you're not currently here, at least it's on the video for the record. Ms. Domingos.
Yeah, hi. I would thank you so much, Mr. Parker, for that, for your comments. I just, there was a statement that was made between Ms. Maxwell and Mr. Tilden, and it really bothered me. And I wrote it down so I don't forget. And it spoke about folks in custody dying of an overdose and being classified as an accident. An accident is when somebody is at home, on their streets, on their couch, and they overdose. For folks that are in custody that are supposed to be scanned, body scanned, and thoroughly checked before booked into custody, I personally do not see that as an accident. I'm not speaking for this board. So that comment in of itself really, really concerned me because accidents can only happen in controlled settings if somebody is not doing their job. But that being said, I did want to put that out there in the universe here with everyone and on the tape. But I also wanted to acknowledge the committee members for their hard work on this issue of racial profiling and racial disparity. My co-chair, Mr. Tim Ware, Mr. Wilson, also Ms. Bonnie Kink, and Mr. Parker for attending our meetings and just being there to make sure that we were on track and abiding by the rules and regulations, and also our counsel, Ms. Hoffman.
Thank you, Ms. Domingos. We did have one other request to speak, but in reference to a comment that you just made, just to be clear, and again, if Dr. Campman was here, it would be very good. But having said that, I can tell you that for manner of death determination, there are specific definitions. There are only 5 manners of death that go onto a death certificate. So just like sometimes you'll hear that a law enforcement involved shooting was a homicide, but yet a jury comes back and says, well, no, it was a legitimate, or, you know, for lack of a better term, it was a justified shooting. It doesn't necessarily mean homicide from a criminal culpability perspective, that manner of death. Same thing with accident. There are only 5. And so for medical legal death determination, death certificate determination, accident would be used for an overdose. If there was no indication that it was a suicide, it would be accident. So with that, just from a medical legal perspective, but hopefully Dr. Campman can clarify that in the future CLERB meetings. Thank you very much. And Ms. Williamson. Ms. Williamson, are you? Hold on one second. Ms. Williamson,
There we
are you
go.
there? There you are.
Yes, I was still on mute. I guess my concern was for today. I was at the Board of Supervisors, and media asked a question of the interim sheriff about in custody deaths that were ingested drugs, came into the jail, and then died 6 days later. It's my understanding that you all, that the jails have a body scanner. Is that correct, Mr. Parker?
Yes, my understanding is that the intake facilities have body scanners, yes.
And so someone who is coming into the jails that has ingested drugs and then dies, would that, like, what is that considered?
As far as from a medical examiner perspective, ma'am?
As far as from a, you know, standpoint of, does everyone go through the body scanner? Does the body scanner or not? Or does the body scanner pick up? Would the body scanner pick up packets that are in your body? Or is it just weapons that are on your body? And if these individuals did not go through a body scanner, would it then be negligence instead of, you know, whatever it is that the 5 categories are for people
Right.
that.
Well, there are a couple of different things, right? So we're looking at from a death determination standpoint, but then, so that's one thing, right? And then you have the criminal culpability, that's another thing, but then following policies and procedures internally may rise to the level of criminal culpability if they're not followed, but that's another thing. So as far as the internal practices and policies, not being a sheriff expert, I can tell you though, what I do know is that the deputies are trained when they are trained by the folks that created or the vendors for the body scanner, they are taught to look for abnormalities, things that are not the same on one side of the body versus another side of the body. And then if they see something that is not, it doesn't pass, you know, what they believe to be a clear scan, then there's additional follow-up that needs to be done by those sworn members. So that's one thing. Is it possible that someone could bring drugs into the jail and it not be picked up on a scanner? Well, I would imagine so. And if that's the case, from a medical legal perspective, more often than not, unless you inject someone with something against their will, it would either, the medical examiner is going to say that that is an accidental death, an overdose death, unless there is so much in there that the medical examiner could opine that it is a suicide. So your question has a lot of different answers, and I hope Ms. Williamson and I was able to at least address some of them.
Kind of, but thank you.
All right, well, hey, bring it out. What else? What else, Ms. Williamson? Come on.
I mean, I just kind of feel like I was a protester and my body was scanned. Like they didn't, if they had found anything or seen anything, then there should have been a next step. But to have someone die 6 days later or 5 days or 4 days later, like we have seen in some in custody deaths, you know, it just seems negligent to me and to a lot of community members. And I feel that maybe there's a huge lack of understanding and mistrust on how people arrive at their decisions. And then we have, of course, a jury or a judge that arrives at a totally different decision during civil litigation. I hope that people are not blinded by this kind of culture that, you know, officers are looked at as, you know, not really responsible for things that they should be responsible for because their job is so hard, or, you know, because there's so much compassion for them. And I think that it causes biases to accountability.
Ms. Williamson, just, and thank you. What I will say is that last month at our CLERB meeting, this board sustained a finding against a deputy for an improper scan. So this board has done that. And we are looking at those things to ensure that that does not happen again. You'll also see that in the next month or two, there will be additional recommendations that we staff are going to make to the CLERB board in reference to scanning of folks, when they're scanned, who's scanned, talking about, well, again, you'll see that we'll make some policy recommendations coming up in the next month or two that hopefully can address some of the concerns brought forth by you and also by Ms. Maxwell. So with that, thank you. And with that, Mr. Mingus, I see Ms. Pintar has a question.
Thanks, Paul. Your comment about additional recommendations regarding body scans may speak to this already. But I know that a lot of the cases that we review and a lot of the discussion here tonight has been about what happens at intake, particularly as it relates to people, you know, to either medical staff or sworn staff not recognizing, you know, someone who might be in distress, but they aren't seeing it at intake, and then they pass away within a very short period of time while in custody. That being said, I wondered if my fellow board members think it would be appropriate or helpful to have the Sheriff's Department come to a future board meeting and walk through the intake process with us. I thought of I asked the question in relationship particularly to Ms. Williamson's question about who gets scanned. Does everybody get scanned? I don't know the answer. Maybe you do, Paul, and we don't need the sheriffs to come and tell us, but I think it would be helpful for me, at least, if not everyone else, to hear about the intake process. That's a question. The second thing I just wanted to state is that I completely hear what Ms. Williamson and Ms. Maxwell said about, you know, who's responsible for these drugs that these detainees are getting once they're in custody. I know that when we've reviewed these cases, some of these cases, we've seen or read that, you know, they died of having a mix of either prescription and non-prescription prescription drugs in their system. Oftentimes it could be a combination of prescribed drugs and fentanyl. I still am at a loss for how we have how they have so much access to these drugs. Maybe that's a naive question, but I think for me, it's a big frustration not knowing how we can provide better oversight to that point in particular. So I just wanted to state that because I've heard a couple people say it, and I just wanted to express that I feel that frustration as well.
I see Ms. Nadia Keen-Ayub, if you don't have any other comments, Mr. Parker.
No, I think to Ms. Pintar's point, obviously, I'll reach out to the department to have someone come and discuss the intake process, specifically about the drug eradication efforts that the department is making. There is room for improvement. I think that everybody will indicate as much, despite everything that the department is doing, which is why, you know, we could talk about not sustaining and not sustaining certain, as opposed to just saying action justified whenever there's an overdose, that nothing was done wrong. And you'll see that transition that we've made recently. So I also want to point out that those folks who are arrested, who go into custody, into those booking facilities, are scanned, with the exception of those suspected or confirmed to be pregnant. But again, that's during the intake process. Now, there is some room for improvement on the policy about perhaps folks who leave a facility and then come back, are they then scanned once they've left the facility and come back into the facility? And these are things that we as staff are looking at, and we'll advise the board more as we move forward. But having said that, I hope that at least answers the question a little bit, Ms. Pintar. And with that, Ms. Kinayu.
Mine was to Ms. Pintar's point, and it's a question for Mr. Tilden. Mr. Tilden, is San Diego an average in terms of in-custody deaths for overdoses? And if not, what are the differences that are in other agencies and other facilities that you see that stand out that are causing us to have such a difference?
Yeah, we probably can't speak to differences in overdoses because, again, I think the deaths are categorized in these very specific buckets. So looking at the differences, at least between the 4 counties, there are a higher number of accidental deaths in San Diego, we noted. There were 31 of the 185 deaths were accidental deaths, which is a higher number than we noted in the other counties. The number of deaths by suicide was much higher than the other counties. Again, it was 52 of the in-custody deaths were by suicide, and that was a very high number. Those are probably, the other thing is a number of natural deaths. 88 of the 185 deaths were natural deaths. And that seems like a kind of a high number too. But unfortunately, the data that we have it's not to that level where we can speak to the number of individuals that specifically died due to a drug overdose.
I'm sorry. You said that there was a high number of suicides and high number of natural deaths and high number of what you state are accidental deaths. That to me is concerning in the fact that it reflects maybe a lack of health concerns and focus on what is going on specifically with the people that are brought into custody. Did you see anything in San Diego that demonstrated that there was perhaps a lack of attention to the basic overall health of the people in custody?
Well, that was really goes back to some of the core findings that we had, is that in San Diego, we found that they're not doing a good job of identifying individuals' mental health needs or medical needs. And then compounded by the fact that they're not always doing a good job of ensuring that individuals that do have mental health or medical needs are getting appropriate follow-up care. So those are actually 2 of the key findings that we had in terms of reasons for the high number of deaths in San Diego.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. A couple of questions. First of all, to follow up on Ms. Pintar's statement on the intake process, and this may be a question for Madam Chair Delaney, or Mr. Parker, you may know this as well. Don't we have access or are able to physically see the intake process when we go on a tour of the facilities?
Yes, you would. Yes, you would.
Okay, great. So I don't know, maybe a field trip is in order. The other question is for Mr. Tilden. Again, thank you guys and Ms. Sanders for the great report. My question is, you've done these reports in past years. And when you've done these reports in past years, or maybe I'm speaking on a turn, I don't know, I'm sure this is not the first one, but when you do these reports, what has been the results of the prior reports? Have they promoted change with those facilities or in other areas? Do they jump on the results or recommendations? Is it something we should expect because we received this audit and now we should respect based on past practices that certain things should be done with this entity here as far as the Sheriff Department?
That's a good question. I think one of the benefits of conducting an audit is that we have the ability to get the data, to analyze the data, to review case files and video surveillance, to really address the questions of the legislature. And I think one of the benefits is that when we put out a report, it really can shine a spotlight on problems. And it gives us an opportunity to really highlight needed corrections. And to answer your question, we have a process for audits where when we issue recommendations to auditees, they generally have to report back to us on their efforts to implement our recommendations periodically. This audit's a little bit different because we didn't issue recommendations directly to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. And that's primarily because, they don't seem to have a very robust process for reviewing and taking corrective actions after deaths occur. They don't have a great track record in terms of implementing recommendations from others. So here, because of the severity of this issue and the ongoing deaths that are occurring, we thought it was more appropriate to make legislative recommendations. And it's our understanding that the legislature is already moving forward with a bill that would require the San Diego County Sheriff, as well as other jails in California, to make these improvements.
Okay, so you're not saying that because of their neglect in their process that we're not going to hold them to the same standard. We're just saying that we're going to go in a different way to reach that standard, correct?
Right, correct.
Last question for Mr. Parker. As it relates to the manner of death, I'm stuck on 5. I have accidental, natural, homicide, and suicide. What's the 5th one?
Undetermined. And then
Okay.
undetermined is the final one, but on cases where they think that there's maybe some drugs involved or some neuropathological issues or whatnot, you'll see pending. That's not a final death certificate, but there is that 6 pending. That's a temporary finding.
Thank you.
Mr. Mingos, we have 4 members of the public. We have 1 member of the CLERB board, and I know there's 1 CLERB staff member that would like to have a question as well. Where do you want to go, Mr. Mingos? Two of these public speakers have spoken already. 2 have not, and then Ms. Delane, or Vice Chair Delane.
Yes, so I would like to hear from the members of the public that haven't spoken first. And if it's acceptable, then hear from the vice chair and then the 2 members of the public that have spoken before.
Very well. We'll go to Gary Brown. Mr. Brown.
Yes, sir. Maybe it's a bit of follow-up to Mr. Ware's recent questions, but with when the legislation, the state auditor has made recommendations to the state legislature. The state is obviously working on corrective legislation. Who then is responsible, or what agency is responsible to make sure that the sheriff's departments throughout the state are properly following the law?
I think that for the recommendations that we have, again, they're to the legislature to require the San Diego Sheriff Department to make improvements in these different areas. And I think it's my understanding that the pending bill that Dr. Weber and other members have drafted would actually require the Board of State and Community Corrections to change its standards to address these issues. So the benefit of doing that is that it would apply not just to the San Diego County Sheriff, but to all the detention facilities in the state, all the local detention facilities.
Good. Thank you.
Next, we will go to Harry Burnett.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, my question has to do with trends. There's the numbers that you've spoken about, 185 should be sufficient for someone to establish trends. Are all on a weekend? They all occur with a certain shift for the sheriff's department, more in one jail than another? And then my second question, if I can get it all out at the same time, 57 deaths were uninvestigated by CLERB. I understand that disciplinary action can't be taken against a deputy unless the investigation is completed within a year or a deadline of that sort. Well, corrective action in jail can be identified after a year. So what's stopping you from completing an investigation regarding corrective action? It doesn't have to be for a disciplinary action. And I'll lower my hand now. Thank you.
I could take the last part of that question. This is something that we had actually contemplated back in 2017, but unfortunately, the decision was made to move forward due to the investigatory action of the discipline, as you, Mr. Burnett, as you mentioned. Looking back, I mean, you know, if obviously if things could have been done differently, you know, previous administration would have prioritized these deaths correctly, so we wouldn't even have to have this conversation. I could tell you that moving forward, I think that's all that I can do at this point, Mr. Burnett, due to our rules and regulations and also the standards at the, you know, POBAR and whatnot. But I do understand, and I do wish we would have been able to do something different. In reference to the first part of your question, Mr. Tilden, I don't know if that was directed at you or I don't recall, quite frankly.
I mean, I can speak to what we did. I mean, we did analyze trends, but we analyzed annual trends. We have a figure in our report that shows the number of deaths every year for the last 15 years from 2006 to 2021. And in terms of trends, you know, when you look at it, I would say from 2014 to 2020-21, the rate of deaths in San Diego have increased. And as far as breaking that down to weekends or weekdays, again, we didn't do that fine of an analysis, but what we determined is that there are systemic breakdowns that are occurring that I think are really going to be having a detrimental effect 7 days a week.
Very well. Ms. Domingos, we have Vice Chair Delaney and then two members of the public who have already spoken. That's Mr. Miller and Ms. Williamson, but we do have time for everyone, I believe.
Yeah, as agreed upon, Ms. Vice Chair.
You go ahead and let the members of the public go first. That's okay.
All right.
Ms. Williamson.
Yes, my comment is to Mr. Mike Tilden. With all the task force that are created in the community, I find it very hard that there's no task force created for corrupt law enforcement departments. Can the State Department and Attorney General work together to create a task force to investigate drug and other items being trafficked into the jails by deputies and staff? I would include California Correction Healthcare Services. However, their staff may be involved in some of that trafficking. This is a health crisis. It is criminal and found to be a problem nationally.
I mean, we didn't look specifically at that, but I think that's a good question. And maybe that's a question for the Attorney General's office, whether there could be that kind of a collaboration. But we didn't specifically look at that.
Is that something that maybe you could, the Attorney General is not really great at working with community. We have several organizations that have reached out and had no correspondence from the Attorney General for months. And so I'm wondering if the State Department can look into forming a meeting with the Attorney General to look into that, since you've done the audit.
And I guess I would recommend, that's not normally kind of in the scope of what we do. I mean, the Joint Legislative Audit Committee approves an audit and we can conduct the audit, and we put out recommendations. We also do have the authority to do a follow-up audit at some point in time that we could exercise. But it might make sense to reach out to your representatives in the legislature to try to pursue that kind of a communication, or to try to facilitate more communication with the Attorney General's office. That's probably my suggestion.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller.
Yes, first I want to say congratulations to Ms. Buki Domingos for running such a wonderful town hall and very orderly. Thank you very much. My question is directed towards the auditors. There's been a movement to sort of minimize the impact of this audit report by questioning the formula which we come up with our findings and the rates. And it seems like they want to know the difference between the average daily population, which is, I feel, is the correct number to use, and versus the booking number, which is, of course, by definition, not necessarily in custody numbers of populations. So could you please explain more about the formula that you use to come up with your data?
Yeah, so I'll probably need Michelle to help me out with that, but you're right. We did look at the numbers of deaths based on average daily jail population, as well as the average booked per year. And I think in terms of looking at the numbers death based on the number of individuals booked per year, San Diego is number 3 of the 15 largest counties that we looked at. So again, that's just one more metric where San Diego again rises up near the top. Number 1 is Los Angeles. And we do have, if you have a copy of our report, we have a table that breaks all that down on page 60.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And just a note, a statement of note that the booking number also includes book and release, which will not constitute in custody. A lot of people are booked the same day released, whether it's released on their own recognizance or they are released by bail. And that would minimize the number if we use that number to determine in custody deaths, which some groups would appreciate, because that would take us out of the top running and the top 3 in the counties that are our same size, in the top in the whole state of California. But I just wanted to get some clarification on that, so that we don't fall for that kind of manipulation of the data, where we have the booking number, which includes book and release, which is about 1/3 of the total booking of people into custody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Domingos, we have no additional public requests to speak that I'm aware of. Vice Chair Delaney is next, I believe.
Thank you. Couple of things regarding the detention center tours. We did go through intake, and I know that that's something that we are going to be looking at carefully when we start doing the detention center inspections, because that seems to be where a lot of the problems are. The other thing is, this has made it very clear to me. It really demonstrates the need for CLERB to be able to investigate the medical and mental health aspects, which we are very limited in investigating right now. This is just, it's heartbreaking and it's heart-wrenching. And I hope through our continued pushing and reports that we can make headway and actually see some positive changes.
Ms. Domingos, I will turn the floor back over. Well, actually, it looks like Mr. Miller, you may have another question, or maybe you didn't lower your hand. Mr. Miller?
I'm sorry, I just didn't lower my hand. Thank you.
All right, I'll take care of that. Thank you. And with that, Ms. Domingos, we have no additional requests to speak.
Mr. Parker, you had mentioned that you would like to speak to the recommendations that the CLERB has made, because I know that we have had, this is the second town hall. First one we had when the CPE released their reports, not too long after that. And now we're having the second one. And I know that folks are wondering, so we're having all these town halls, we're having all these meetings. What is the CLERB actually doing? And as folks know, we are the civilian oversight, and we can turn in recommendations in the hope that the Sheriff's Department follows suit. So if you'd like to talk about the recommendations that the CLERB has made fairly recently and what the responses have been, so folks are aware of the work that CLERB is actually doing on the ground.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Domingos. What I'd like to say are a couple of things. In reference to some of the items that Mr. Tilden mentioned earlier, we as the CLERB have put forth policy recommendations to address those very issues: the safety checks, the not breaking of the stride, the medical emergencies, sometimes there's not an efficient response, not an expeditious response. So we appreciate the auditor acknowledging the policy recommendations that we too have made to the department, and then moving forward to ensure, especially with Dr. Weber's bill AB 2343, that would get this to be a standard statewide, because even if it saves just one life, right, that's awesome. As far as the recommendations that the state auditor made for CLERB as part of this audit, we have a 60-day report back that's due April 4th. But I will, with the acting state auditor here and Ms. Sanders, I will say that the 6 recommendations were that we work with the Deputy Sheriff's Association to try to work out a way to get interviews and to get information through face-to-face interviews. I can tell you, we are still working with the Deputy Sheriff's Association. They have been responsive. I've been talking to their president. And now that we have new outside counsel, we will now get together with their counsel to try to work on this and make this a collaborative effort to get information as part of our investigations. We're in the process of updating our training manual. That was the second recommendation. We do have a training manual. It's just not it could be a lot better. We'll just leave it at that. And so we're in the process of doing so. Our policies and procedures have already been updated and implemented to ensure that our death cases are completed within 3 months of assignment, 3 months of when we receive the materials from the Sheriff's Department. Hence the reason I made the promise earlier to the Rodriguez family that we would have hopefully Saxon's case on the agenda by May. We will move forward with that. The rules and regulations, they have suggested that we update our rules and regulations to make in-custody deaths the priority over everything else. Working with county council to do just that. To update our rules and regulations to include natural deaths as part of the deaths that we investigate. Basically, to standardize the practice that we have implemented during my tenure as executive officer, so that if in case there was an administrative change and I'm fired or whatnot, that we still look at natural deaths, and we're in the process of doing so. And the final recommendation was to look at deaths and the overall trends in those deaths, and to report out, starting with our 2021 annual report, to talk about demographics, location, manner. We started to do that last year, but one of the things I didn't have were demographics, and that's on me. But starting this year, based on obviously the community feedback first and foremost, and then the recommendation from the state auditors as second, we will be implementing that as well. I do want to point out that Acting Sheriff Kelly Martinez and myself on February 14th signed a memorandum of understanding that would allow CLERB to go to in-custody death scenes. Unfortunately, since February 14th, when I signed the MOU, I've been to 3 death scenes, and I've been to 2 deputy-involved shooting scenes. So that's 5 that the Sheriff's Department has been collaborative and professional and exchange of information and whatnot. So there is progress on that point as well. So I just want to give an overview, and I think I'll stop there if anybody has any questions for me about what we've done in response to the audit, in response to our policy recommendations about deaths in custody, and our focus of prioritization of deaths in custody.
Thank you so much, Mr. Parker. I see 2 hands up here from my committee members. First hand I saw up was Mr. Wilson, and the second hand I saw up was Mr. Ware. So Mr. Wilson, please go ahead.
Yes, we've mentioned that there's an issue with intake. As I recall, there are civilians who are employees of the county that work in intake. And like the medical personnel, we currently do not have jurisdiction over those individuals. So I would, in our looking at our areas of jurisdiction, we should keep that in mind, that there are civilian employees of the Sheriff's Department. And perhaps our jurisdiction should include being able to investigate them as well.
To Mr. Wilson's point, and so that the auditors are aware, members of the public are aware, we have recommended, and this board has given me the authority to work with county staff to attempt to obtain jurisdiction over those folks providing medical and mental health care to folks in our detention facilities, to include contract employees as well. So that was what we are working on. The San Diegans for Justice report that just came out on March 3rd wants to expand that and would like for the Board of Supervisors and this, it would actually have to be the Board of Supervisors at this point to expand our jurisdiction to include all personnel of the Sheriff's and Probation Department for the very reasons mentioned by Mr. Wilson. Obviously, not that I'm trying to build an empire as has been alleged on occasion, but we would agree with that so that we can get a full picture of the deaths and the activities that occur. But that's something that's out of our hands at this point. But thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Ware.
Yes, Mr. Parker, thank you for what you do and also your awesome, amazing investigators. And speaking of our investigators, the fact that we're able to have our investigators respond, or you respond to the death scene, does that, we talk about the 3-month investigation period, does the fact that we're there on scene, does that expedite the process or make it longer, because now we can do it even more thorough investigation?
That's a great question, Mr. Ware, because it does not expedite the process. What it does is it provides a level of independence and transparency that the department has agreed to work with us, because our rules and regulations allow us for us to go to scenes, and they are understanding and have accepted our policy recommendation to do so. However, we still cannot complete a thorough investigation until we receive the materials from the department. So we want to make sure that we're looking at every piece of evidence that's available to us prior to us opining, if that makes any sense. So it increases transparency and independence, of course, but as far as the time delay, it's still going to be 3 months from the time that we get all of the materials from the department.
Well, Mr. Parker, I'm going to also take up a collection, send you on a great vacation, because you're not going to be able to go on a vacation for another years, as I understand, correct?
What's the vacation? I don't know what that is. No, you're right, Mr. Ware. Thank you.
All right, folks, we are at 7:23, and I believe this is a 2-hour special meeting tonight. I am just amazed that we have the acting state auditor, Mr. Tilden, who has stuck with us for almost 2 hours. I think that is absolutely amazing. And I applaud that commitment to hear community members, to hear board members, and just to listen to folks and the family member that spoke, to listen to their story. So you actually have a face, which is just one of so many behind your report. And I thank you for being here today and giving us your undivided attention. I know it means a lot to this board. And also, most of all, I know it means a lot to community members that are on this call. So I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Mr. Tilden, Ms. Sanders, we cannot thank you enough for being here and for the work that you've done in reference to the audit. I do have one final, Ms. Domingos, one of our investigators, I believe, has a question. I believe it's for the auditors. I don't know. Ms. Wigfall.
Hi, everybody. This is Claudia Wigfall, Special Investigator. Yes, and Mr. Tilden, so I know you mentioned that during the intake process, and I may have the wording wrong, there's a lack of acknowledgement and with mental health issues, or a lack of just, yeah, lack of acknowledgement with people's mental health issues. Does this also count the individuals that sign the waiver that refuse medical care at intake? Because I know that's something that I've seen happen a lot on my cases. So were those separated or are those counted into that pile?
So I may have to bounce that over to Michelle. My understanding is, at least for the 30 cases that we looked at, we identified individuals that actually had medical needs or mental health issues that were not identified. I understand what you're saying. There are situations where sworn staff or medical professionals will identify an issue, and you might have someone in custody that is basically refusing care. But I don't believe that's what we're talking about. We're talking about situations where basically the sheriff's department personnel, they're just not identifying the issues in the first place. Is that right, Michelle?
Correct. We also, in looking at the policies, did find that concerns about the number of refusals that were signed by sworn officers as opposed to a medical professional who may be in a better position to talk to an individual about, the importance of getting that care. So we did comment on that in the report.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Domingos, Ms. Kenk has her hand raised.
Yes, I just had a question. I've just been sitting here thinking about the in Riverside, the mental health officials that are there during intake. Do they ever, to your knowledge, put the people back into a 5150 where they would go into a hospital as opposed to incarceration?
I'm not sure. Do you know, Michelle?
We did not look at individual cases. We reviewed the policy. But generally at intake, if someone is identified as not being fit for booking, they may be, sent to a hospital. But we did not look at individual cases and focused on the policy at Riverside.
Thank you.
Ms. Domingos, I believe that will be it.
Yeah, so we're just at 3 minutes till 7:30. I would like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. More to follow from the racial disparity and racial inequity ad hoc committee as we continue to work together to come up with concrete recommendations we cannot go back in the past. We cannot bring those lives back. But what we can commit to doing is to move forward and do the best that we can to do better as an ad hoc committee. And I'm sure we have the blessing of the vice chair who is standing in for our chair today to do better as a board. And we just thank everybody that stuck with us today. The office of Dr. Akila Weber showing up at the last minute and spending over an hour and a half just listening to family members. And I believe that is a great, great start just to show up and listen, because in the past, as the numbers show, there is something fundamentally wrong. These families do not feel listened to. They don't feel validated. And sometimes that's a great first step. So I thank everybody for taking time out of their evening to come here and listen. And I thank Mr. Parker also for all the work that you do. And like Mr. Ware said, there's not going to be a vacation for a long time to come. This is has been a long-standing issue that we as a new ad hoc committee and as a new board take very seriously. And we hope that as we continue to have these meetings and continue to send out the policy recommendations, that we're able to mend those fences and rebuild those bridges and start to regain the trust from community, while also being impartial in our decision making as a board. that strives to make sure that law enforcement is held accountable and that family members also have a space like tonight to speak. So thank everybody for joining us today. And if other ad hoc committee members or board members have nothing else to add, I would like to close us out. Mr. Parker, if you have any last comments, the Acting State Auditor, Mr. Tilden, if you have any last comments, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, I thank everybody for joining us tonight and we appreciate you. We will see you at the next CLERB board meeting. Mr. Parker, could you please share with us the date and time?
Sure, it'll be Tuesday, April 12th at 5:30 p.m. And then also I want folks to be aware, first again, thank you, Mr. Tilden, Ms. Sanders, members of the board, the ad hoc committee, but also members of the community who have pushed this issue forward, who have been here, who we want to make sure that the review board operates independently, but within its rules and regulations, charter and code, and ultimately can become the review board that is needed for San Diego County at this time in its history. And whatever that will be, that's something that will be determined by the community members, ultimately in the Board of Supervisors. So that's that. I also want to point out that our independent in-custody death data analysis will be released toward the end of the first week in April. It will be on the agenda for April 12th's meeting. So there'll be more discussions about the deaths that are occurring in custody, and we'll probably have I know we're going to have a town hall toward the end of April in reference to that. So thank you all very, very much. And Mr. Mingos, back to you.
All right, everybody, we wish you all a safe evening and Godspeed to folks who are going through treatment, healing, to a family member who's in an accident, and anybody else that just needs, some divine intervention today. I know this was very heavy stuff, so I thank folks for sticking with us, and my condolences to all the families. So permission to end our town hall, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Michelle. I'm sorry I don't have your last name, but thank you. And thank you, Mr. Tilden, and of course the ad hoc committee members. Buki, you did a great job. Tim, thank you. Gary, Bonnie, and members of the public. Again, thank you very much. It is a heavy subject, and
You're very welcome.
you guys, everyone take care, and we'll see you soon.